I'm wearing a microphone, but I don't think it's switched on. So I'm assuming nobody needs me to turn it on. Is everybody okay with the volume? Fine. Thank you. That was a nice introduction from Robin. But main thanks really for me is for all of you for being here tonight. I'm assuming some at least of you have got an interest in the Spanish Civil War itself, although I know some of you are also just regular attendees at the lectures. Robin says my name, my pen name is David Ebsworth. My real name is Dave McCall. I write historical fiction under that pen name. One of my great passions is for Spain, and particularly for the Spanish Civil War, and two of the novels that I've written so far are here, The Assassin's Mark and Until the Curtain Falls. The second one is pretty much a sequel to the first. And it's kind of timely to be here doing this tonight because we're just past 80 years since the end of the Spanish Civil War came to an end in March, end of March, beginning of April 1939. But these days, most modern historians recognise that actually that wasn't the end of the Spanish Civil War at all, and that the Spanish Civil War, the conflict that we now call the Spanish Civil War, was actually the first 3 years of what we now know as the Second World War, because the two things very much link in and run into each other. I'll explain why in a little while. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, if that's okay, and then leave some space for questions and answers. And I thought just to start, probably worthwhile to just give the background. How many of you have been to Spain? Oh, brilliant. Right. Some of you have already got an interest in the Spanish Civil War, or not? Some of you have. Okay, lovely. Quick background then for those that haven't, and I will be fairly brief about this if I can wake up which button to press. I think it's probably that one. Okay. So the things to remember for this are that Spain had been governed by a dictatorship for almost all of the 1920s. In 1931, there was a plebiscite that, by which the people of Spain decided to declare themselves a republic. The Spanish monarchy went into exile, and at that time, Spain was a very mixed country. My favourite book, if you want to do this in a lot of depth, and I'd highly recommend this book, it's called The Life and Death of the Spanish Republic by a man called Henry Buckley. And Buckley is interesting because he was Catholic. He classed himself as right of centre in his politics. He was a journalist for the Daily Telegraph at the time, and he went out to cover Spain in 1929, and he stayed there right until the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939. So he was there right the way through, and the book really marks the changes in his own perceptions of Spain and the politics of Spain and the ethics of the conflict that took place in Spain during those 10 years. And Buckley describes in fabulous detail the way he arrives in Spain in 1929, and he said that if you went to any of the major cities that we'd all know very well, to Valencia or Barcelona or to Madrid or Alicante, these were fabulously cultured cities, but if you went literally a mile outside the city boundaries, it was like stepping back into the 15th century. And he said this was just a feudal society outside of the cities themselves. This was a feudal society where literally everyday life and death was controlled by the army, by the church, and by the local landowners, normally absentee landowners. And he describes the way in which this feudal society works in a lot of detail. He talks a lot about the ethics of the country at that time, and I'll maybe come back and speak a bit more about that later. The advent of the Republic sparked 5 years of quite bitter political toing and froing between left and right in Spain, and in February 1936, a left-of-centre Popular Front coalition government was elected, and they were pledged really to bringing in very, very major reforms to all of those policies that have been held dear by the church, the army, and the landlords. And this was anathema to those controlling groups. And over the course of the next few months, A plot was hatched among some of the leading army generals, and in July 1936 there was a military coup. Four major generals leading that rebellion, and as generals in the army always do, they imagined that it would all be over by Christmas, that somehow Spain would come to its senses, see that they'd made a wrong decision in this election in February of that year, and all would be well with will. Of course, that's absolutely not what happened. The army and the country pretty much split down the middle. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the sort of ethics of the thing and what was going to follow was spelt out very, very rapidly, literally within weeks of the rebellion taking place. Hitler had started to send large contingents of the Luftwaffe, called the Condor Legion in Spain, and would eventually send 12,000 ground troops to help Franco and the other generals. Mussolini would send 50,000 ground troops, and the whole of the Italian navy put at the disposal of the rebel generals. On the other side, half of the army remained loyal to the Republic, to the elected government, and into the fray come workers' militias who become armed. The Soviet Union begins to send tanks and some military advisors. Mexico and Poland send freights of antique weapons. And into the fray come the International Brigade Volunteers, who some of you may know about. So this is 35,000 volunteers who flocked to Spain to fight on the side of the Republic, and they come from 54 different countries. 9,000 Frenchmen, 5,000 Germans and Austrians, for whom this is absolutely a death sentence. To go from Germany or Austria in 1936 to fight on the side of a left-wing government in Spain is a death sentence. The same for the 4,000 Italians who went to fight on the side of the Republic. 4,000 Poles went there. 2,800 Americans ended up going to Spain to fight on the side of the Republic, and 2,500 British and Irish as well. Their backgrounds, they really fall into three different categories. There were those people who were blue-collar workers, miners, dock workers, and so on, who considered themselves to be politically sussed out, to be politically knowledgeable, mostly self-educated, and with kind of a vision of going to Spain to fight for democracy there. There were left-wing academics who went to fight again, who were politically aware, and about 40% of all of the International Brigade's volunteers were Jewish. Mostly people, again, who understood the politics of what was happening in the mid-1930s and who went to Spain because they knew damn well the way that our British government knew and most other governments of the world knew at the time what was happening in Nazi Germany in 1936 and 1937. So a very mixed group, really. And on the other hand, yes, there are volunteers who go out to fight for Franco and the generals as well, but far less of them, around about 1,000 people. They're mostly British Catholics, Irish Catholics, Polish Catholics, but just 1,000 of those. And that really is a sort of background. This is then the beginning, really, of the conflict and what's going to come next. So what I normally like to do when I do these talks kind of all over the country, and I've never yet been to a region of the country that hasn't got its own very special links to the Spanish Civil War, and Suffolk is no exception to that. So just a few samples, really, and I suppose really this is to kind of highlight the nature of the people who were involved in the conflict in Spain. So in the middle of this picture, on the top left-hand side, is a man called Fred Copeman. He was born in Beccles workhouse. He joined the Navy as a young man. He was involved in the Invergordon mutiny in 1931, and he went off to fight in Spain in 1937, and he became one of the commanders of the British battalion within the 15th Brigade, and served with distinction right the way through the conflict itself. So very typical example, really, those kind of working class, blue collar members of society that were politically astute. Benjamin Britten, of course, another Suffolk connection, and Benjamin Britten said quite famously that it was the Spanish Civil War that shaped both his politics and his ethics. For those that don't know it, part of his war requiem is this, the Ballad of the Heroes, which he wrote very specifically to honour the role played by the International Brigade volunteers during the conflict itself. The ship here is the Cantabria. It's quite well known because the Spanish brought the Civil War to Suffolk when a battleship, a nationalist battleship controlled by the generals, chased this cargo ship right the way up the English Channel and right the way up the coast of Suffolk and sank it off the coast of Suffolk. Her crew was rescued by local lifeboat crews, this wasn't just about people who went to fight. I'll just a quick mention really to the couple on the right, on the bottom right-hand side, because again, these are sort of fairly typical of some of the intellectuals that went out. This is Michael John Cornford. Do you know John Cornford? Who was a beautiful poet from Cambridge, who went out to, he was one of the first volunteers in the International Brigade, British battalion, and he was one of the first people to die in Cordova at the back end of 1936. And the lady beside him is Margot Heinemann, who was his friend and companion. And Margot did a lot to kind of raise funds, and through the Aid to Spain committee that functioned all over Britain at the time, and helped, amongst other things, to bring many thousands of Basque children here as volunteers. And this is a photograph taken of Wickham Market, which I don't think is too far away from here, sort of over towards the coast. And this was a colony that was established there to house those Basque refugee children. British government didn't want to know refugees at that time, not that much changes, but against the wishes of the government, many thousands of these children were housed here, and we had the great honour last time we were down in Suffolk. We did one of these sessions, and at the end of the session, a guy put his hand up at the back and he said, "I was one of the children who lived in the colony." So an interesting mix, really. And of course, I can't do Suffolk, can I, without mentioning Southwold and George Orwell. But I'm not going to kind of do too much on this. You probably know more about George Orwell than I do. But of course, he spent most of the 1920s and the early 1930s in Suffolk. It was, again, the place that shaped a great deal of his writing. And we had the privilege of going and doing a talk like this in Southwold last year, I think it was, and spent a bit more time on Eric Blair, and of course on homage to Catalonia, which everybody these days particularly wants to talk about, given what's been happening in Catalonia for the past 18 months, 2 years or so. So that's kind of Suffolk, and all credit really to Suffolk for the role that it and most other parts of Britain played in this important conflict. And the reason I'm doing this is because when I started thinking about writing about the Spanish Civil War, I was looking for an angle that would be a little different to maybe to what had been written in lots of other things before. And these literally just some samples. So there are many, many books that feature the Spanish Civil War one way or the other. My favourite is actually there's a trilogy of books by a man called Arturo Barea, who you may or may not know, but well worth reading, and that's in very good English translation. But I was minded of some of these other books. So Hemingway, particularly, I know I'm a sucker for this, but I love Ernest Hemingway. And I went back and I reread For Whom the Bell Tolls. I hadn't read it for many years, and I went back and reread it before I started writing, and I was instantly struck by how, as beautiful a book as that can be, at times, you got right to the very end of it, you wouldn't have the faintest idea what was happening in Spain by the time you'd finished reading it, because it's almost a contemporary thing. Hemingway didn't think he needed to explain the Spanish Civil War, so for our contemporary readers, it can be a little difficult to sort of follow what's going on. So I wanted to do something that was kind of a bit, it sounds really tweedish now I say it, so something that was kind of a bit educational, would, you know, inform people about the Spanish Civil War, but actually it was just a good page turner as well. It was a, you know, a thriller. And I was mulling this for ages. So the first of my things you might not know was the role of Suffolk in the Spanish Civil War. The second was this. I was looking for this kind of angle of how to tell the story, and I was contacted by a professor at San Diego University, a colleague called Sandy Holguin, and Sandy said to me, you might not have seen this. And at that time, Sandy Holguin was the only person in the world, well, San Diego University archives in truth, but Sandy was the only person who'd read any of this stuff about Franco's battlefield tourism. And what had happened was that at the beginning of the war, you'll probably know this, most of the propaganda battle went very much Franco's way, and the way of the generals, because the papers, you know, again, the Telegraph have been full of all these stories about priests being shot by the Reds and so on and so forth, and it was very heavy stuff. It was only kind of part of the story, naturally, but it was still very telling on the public. So the propaganda battle had very much gone the way of the generals to a large extent. And then in the beginning of 1937, in April 1937, they made a really, really, from a propaganda point of view, fatal mistake. And they bombed a little town in northern Spain called Guernica. German and Italian bombers bombed it to oblivion, killed hundreds of innocent women, children, and local campesino farmers. And all of a sudden, the propaganda war turned the other way. And Franco had to do something about this, and he had a colleague, a man called Luis Bolin, who features a bit more in the story. By this time, the country split in half. Franco and the generals have established an alternative government in Burgos in northern Spain. So Madrid is still held by the Republic, still being defended. It's been under siege now for 18 months, but hasn't fallen to the nationalists. Burgos is now the capital of what they call national Spain, and the very first thing that Franco and the generals did, perfectly reasonable, they invented their own currency. So they established what's called the Burgos peseta, and we're fortunate they're not really worth an awful lot now. This is a 5,000 peseta note. It's probably worth about £2.80, but anyway, there it is. And the second thing they did, which still seems quite extraordinary to me, you set up an alternative currency. Second thing you do is you establish a national tourist department. This is true. This is perfectly true. And the idea was, so they produced this brochure, which is one of the most bizarre things I think I've ever seen in my life. We have copies of this. This is only the kind of the front side of it. And I'm sure you can read this yourself. It says, National Spain invites you to visit the war routes of Spain, and nice map of the route along the north coast that the tour would follow. The top of the picture has these beautiful scenes of northern Spain, of the beaches, paella, come and hunt the elusive chamois, etc., etc. Step outside my mark. I was told strictly to stay within this square for the. They'll wipe that off the film, don't worry. And at the bottom, there are these bizarre pictures of Franco and his generals stomping through the ruins of the cities that they've just bombed into oblivion. And they produced this brochure in every European language, and they went out at the end of 1937, beginning of 1938, to every single tourist company in Europe, so to Thomas Cook's and Swan Tours and so on and so forth. Bizarre. Even more bizarre is that as soon as they hit the shops, people start flocking to sign up for the tours. It cost you £8. You started off at the border with Irun. You got on a 14-seater bus that had been kindly provided free of charge by the Chrysler Corporation in America as part of their support for Franco and the Generals. And you paid £8 for all of your board, your lodging, and your transport for the whole of the week, and it took you back to the border at Irun again. And of course, what happened was every time you stopped somewhere, the tour guide who was on the bus with you would sort of tell you the story of the Civil War from Franco's perspective, from the perspective of the nationalists. So it's a huge propaganda exercise, really. Between July 9th, they had enough takers for those tours to run every single week from the 1st of July 1938 until the 1st of July 1945. They ran for 7 years, every week, week in, week out, and they attracted 20,500 tourists on them from all over Europe. British tourists going to Spain on battlefield tours right the way through the Second World War. And we have the lists of who they were and sort of where they've come from and so on and so on. Bizarre story, isn't it, really? And I've already said the reason, so 20,010, sorry, I'll say exactly. And the purpose of this is kind of pretty much as it says here, this was to try and overcome the bad press that had arisen from the bombing of Guernica. So this '30s, 1940s, it was still Reynolds News, and it was owned by the Cooperative Party, and it was run really by the cooperative movement, and its job as it saw itself was to tell those stories that nobody else really wanted to tell. So there was a lot of really good investigative journalism done through Reynolds News, and I'll mention just a little bit of this later. So